and thank you very much for joining me wherever you are in the world. My name is Shane MacGuill. I'm the Global Head of Tobacco Research at Euromonitor International, and it's my privilege to have been asked to give a brief presentation today on the interrelationship between the evolving legal cannabis landscape and vape as a delivery mechanism. So, as I said, I work for Euromonitor International. For those of you who may not be familiar with the company, we're a strategic research agency, produce syndicated data on about 30 markets, of which tobacco is one, and hopefully legal cannabis will be another in the near future, and also work with our clients on bespoke projects of special concern. More information obviously available on the Euromonitor website. In terms of myself, I've been with Euromonitor for about 9 years. The majority of those years, thankfully, have been spent working on the tobacco and nicotine space. In the last 3 to 4 years, I've also begun to focus more and more intently on legal cannabis to the point now where I more or less share my time between the two. And from that perspective, what I'd like to do today, in what is quite a brief period of time, is just give a very quick overview on the current state of legal cannabis and the level of legalization globally, what's driving it, to what extent tobacco control is being used as a template or is influential in terms of governments deciding how they're going to regulate legal cannabis, and then really what's the interrelationship between vapor in the cannabis space and vapor in the nicotine space, both now and moving into the future. So I've begun or tended to start describing cannabis legalization globally as like a rolling wave, and I don't think that's too much of an exaggeration. In the last 18 to 24 months, we've seen a number of markets that have liberalized their approach to cannabis in some way, whether that be kind of decriminalization, a different approach to policing, or whether it be things like, legalization of medical cannabis, even in markets that particularly or previously were quite opposed to the concept of cannabis. So I think a long way to go, particularly in many regions, as we can see here on this slide. But I think it's not unreasonable to think that if we cast our mind forward a decade or so from now, that we will see many more markets that are liberalizing their approach to cannabis, and particularly in sort of the current climate that we're living in, where governments will increasingly need tax revenue, where you'll have a consumer base that's increasingly looking for more and more sophisticated kind of mood management type of product. So what is driving cannabis legalization apart from what I've just mentioned there? Generational transition. So you've got a younger generation of consumers and voters coming through now who have a very different, in some ways diametrically opposed perception of cannabis as a substance and whether it's harmful or not. In combination with that, you've got kind of more and more disillusion with legacy substances like alcohol and nicotine in terms of people's confidence in their ability to manage moods, greater awareness of the therapeutic benefits of cannabis, kind of a removal of support for the war on drugs type of paradigm of approaching cannabis regulation, and this idea that we should maybe control and tax instead, and then a range of other factors, some societal around kind of increasingly vocal supporters, people looking across the jurisdictions that have legalized and seeing that the sky hasn't fallen in and believing maybe that something similar could work in their market. So to what extent is tobacco control an issue here or feature of cannabis regulation? I would argue it's quite a big one, whether it be in the policy space, and we have policy advocates, academics arguing that tobacco control regulation makes an appropriate model for cannabis regulation. We're seeing it happening in real terms, like in the Netherlands, where they're running an experiment in terms of recreational legalization, and that is requiring plain packaging and health warnings brought across from the tobacco space, or this just general feeling, I think, exemplified or spelled out quite well here by Deepak Anand, where he talks about just a general feeling that when regulators in Canada, and I think this is true of other markets as well, have looked at the way they regulate other products, they're going to tobacco control as that model that they want to replicate in the cannabis space. So in general terms, when a government decides that it is or is in some ways forced by public support to regulate cannabis, Kilmer from the RAND Corporation has outlined these what he's called the 10 Ps of cannabis regulation, which I think encapsulate those kind of choices that governments need to make, whether it be around who produces, on what basis, the extent to which government should be involved in trying to prevent people from taking up something that they're on the other hand legalizing, potency and purity restrictions, to what extent should they be imposed, and all of these kind of things. I think interestingly we've seen some of those already within the e-vapor space, so things like the profit motive, who should be selling e-cigarettes, on what basis, whether we should be allowing people to promote nicotine strength restrictions in terms of potency and so on. I think you can kind of summarize this into these two poles between more and less restrictive in terms of the approach on the measures themselves, and greater or lesser in state involvement. And if we take that and apply it to those sort of relatively few jurisdictions that have legalized cannabis up to date, we can see that the regimes have tended to lean towards both the more restrictive end, but also with a greater level of state involvement. And I think, we can, with some confidence, assert that that will be a similar concept forward as well. So just before we dig in the last few moments in terms of the relationship between cannabis vapor and nicotine vapor, the other emerging regulatory issues for legal cannabis will be along this clarification of the medical recreational construct. In many markets there is no difference between medical and recreational products. It's really just an access framework that doesn't necessarily affect how people are using either of those products. So in the longer term we'll see the spectrum of regulation. Things like potency restrictions, I think a very important part of the regulatory regime going forward, keeping THC levels down and so on. The way cannabinoids interact with people's existing substance and drug use, and then things like the way the wider infrastructure of our daily lives is set up to accommodate cannabis use or not, things like testing, insurance, and so on. So cannabis and nicotine vapor, as I said, there have evolved in parallel really. We've seen products that have come through from the same kind of stable of products in terms of cannabis herbal vaporization, tobacco, heat not burn, so to speak, and so on. I think the technology has evolved in parallel, and going forward we'll see the same, but also developments, I think, in two areas. One where we'll see multi-substance single platform types of products. So those are products where people can consume cannabinoids, nicotine, and perhaps other substances using the same device. And then also existing nicotine vapor brands and companies leveraging across into the cannabis world as well. And these could be either independent e-vapor companies or manufacturers themselves. Again, for those of you who may not be aware, vapor is actually now a more significant delivery mechanism for cannabis than for tobacco. We estimate the vape share of the US legal cannabis sales around 30%. That contrasts with about just under 8% in terms of the overall tobacco market. So vapor is much more important in cannabis than it is currently in nicotine. And that has some implications, and that interplay will have varied effects. So in terms of a positive effect, what we're likely to see is this kind of feedback loop into nicotine. So the more that users in the cannabis space are using vapor for their cannabis consumption, the more likely that's like to drive back into the nicotine space and increase use of vaporization nicotine. On the other hand, de facto, the popularity of cannabis vapor has negatively impacted on vapor in terms of the e-valley crisis as well. So we saw that last year, where the e-valley crisis, something that was prompted by demand for cannabis vapor products, actually deflected back on the e-vapor, the nicotine vapor space in a greater way. And the data here I'm showing is just from our own nicotine survey, and you can see the change in perception, the worsening in perception amongst both consumers of e-cigarette products but also non-consumers following the e-valley crisis, particularly, spread geographically right across. And so that's something, a crisis that was driven by the popularity of cannabis vapor, that was compounded by cannabis vapor products, albeit black market ones, but is actually devolving back into the e-vapor space as well. So I think going forward, all of those things, both the positive and negative interplay, mean that there will be a number of key areas of shared evolution going forward. One will be this e-valley fallout and the extent to which on both cannabis and e-vapor we see implications from that. I think one of the interesting ones for the cannabis vapor space is the idea of flavor. So will we see flavor restrictions in cannabis vapor in the same way as we've seen in nicotine vapor? Flavor is a coming important aspect of the cannabis industry. I would argue mainstream consumers won't necessarily like the taste of cannabis. They won't necessarily want terpenes as flavors in their cannabis products. And if e-valley and greater restrictions within the e-vapor, nicotine vapor space mean that there will be greater flavor restrictions in cannabis, I think that's obviously a negative for cannabis vapor as we move forward. For both, I think we'll see increased transparency across supply chain companies that are able to communicate about what's exactly in their products and allow consumers to track that as well. I think will be very, very important going forward. User validation and authentication, so this idea of whether it be from an age profile perspective or whether it be from simply a preventing unauthorized use, people being able to lock and unlock their own devices, and I think we'll see that increasingly being important in both the cannabis vapor and e-vapor space. Dose control is something else that we'll see being very important, coming over from things like medical cannabis, but also we will increasingly see that, I think, in the nicotine vapor space. And then finally, something like surveillance consumption, perhaps over the longer term, perhaps again coming out of the current situation where it becomes acceptable for governments to become more involved in monitoring people's individual consumption of certain substances. And again, this is something that can be facilitated by vapor technology in a way it can't be by other formats. And that means that, again, both in cannabis and e-vapor, this could be something of significance going forward. So thank you very much for your time. I understand that was a bit of a whirlwind tour. I'm would be very happy and very interested in continuing the conversation at a later time with anyone who wants to do so. Thank you very much.